सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Macro Sutra. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint, and we're going to be talking about something that's happening right now. There are several states in the country that are in the midst of their election process. Now, there are a lot of things that matter to people when they go to vote, but one of them surely is inflation and how prices are moving. And so that's what Radhika Pandey, Associate Professor at NIPFP, has done for us. She's analyzed the inflation levels in the key poll-bound states. And so that's what we're going to talk about. Thank you so much, Radhika, for joining us.
Thank you, Sharad.
Now, Radhika, first of all, before we get to the states, let's talk about the national level inflation so that we have somewhere, a reference point. Okay. So what is happening at the national level, both for food inflation and non-food?
Sure. So the overall India's retail inflation has eased to a 5-month low of 4.87% in October. And it's mainly due to two factors. One is a favorable base effect because the October of last year, the index number was very high. Right. And therefore, when we compute the difference to arrive at the year-on-year change, we get a smaller number. So base effect is one factor. And the other factor is that the non-food inflation has come down. So we talk about core inflation. Right. So core inflation has come lower from 4.5% in last month to 4.2% this month. In addition, the food inflation has also moderated, but only very slightly. So that is something that is still a cause of concern. And if we look at the momentum of inflation, which is when we compare the previous month with this month. So we are not doing year-on-year change, which is when we compare October of this year with October of last year. But if we compare October with September, what has happened is that the month-on-month inflation has actually increased. What was happening was that it was declining, but now in October it has increased. So there are concerns that though in October inflation has fallen to 4.87%, this moderation is short-lived, and maybe in the coming months we could see inflation inching back above the 5% mark. And that is quite consistent with what the RBI's projection is for October to December quarter, which is 5.6%, and for the entire year also 5.4%. So in a nutshell, while non-food inflation has come down, so we talk about personal care and effects, we talk about clothing, we talk about fuel inflation, all these are subdued in terms of their year-on-year change. But food inflation continues to remain a cause of concern. Even now, cereal inflation is in double digit. Pulses inflation is very high. Spices, again, a very high component in terms of high inflation, even though its weightage is small. Right. So food inflation continues to be a cause of concern.
Right. And now, I'm sure that food inflation is a concern for all of the states that are going for elections, and also obviously the ones that are not going for elections. But let's start with one of the poll-bound states, which is Rajasthan.
Correct.
What has inflation in Rajasthan been like?
So in Rajasthan, inflation has been a persistent problem, not just for October, but if we take this entire calendar year, 2023, the 10 months of 2023, in each of these months, inflation in Rajasthan has been above the national average. So that is one point to note, that inflation in Rajasthan has been above the national average in each of the months of the calendar year. And for the financial year, if we take April to October, inflation has been above the upper threshold of 6%.
Oh, wow. Ouch.
So even though nationally we see that, inflation has come down, it touched 5% last month. Then it has now 4.87. It has come down to 4.87. But if we take the average April to October inflation in Rajasthan, it is above 6%. For October, precisely, it was 6.25%, which is a easing from September. So that is one point. And then the two main drivers of inflation in Rajasthan in the current year has been food inflation, which is there, as you rightly pointed out, across all states. And 2 months, particularly what we saw in the all India figure, also July and August were the 2 months where there were unseasonal rains, which led to spike in vegetable prices, which led to spike in cereal prices. So food inflation was very high in July and August, which pushed up the overall inflation in Rajasthan across the 2023. So since then it has come down, but as compared to some of the other states, inflation is still at a higher level in Rajasthan. In fact, for October also, Rajasthan features as one of the states with the highest inflation level
in the country.
Wow. Other than, so I think it's number 2. The first is Odisha. It is 6.47%, and then Rajasthan 6.25%. So inflation has been a persistent problem. One reason is food inflation. Within food, again, cereals, pulses, spices, vegetables during the 2 months that we talked about, and milk. Milk products has seen double-digit inflation since November 2022 till the mid of this year. So milk inflation is especially very prominent, a very striking feature of Rajasthan inflation.
Okay.
So that is important. And the other point is that Rajasthan has the highest VAT. We know that value-added tax on fuel is one of the highest in Rajasthan. So fuel inflation is in high double digits in Rajasthan. So that has also led to higher inflation. So and it's a sharp contrast with what we see at the all India level, where fuel and light inflation is low, it is subdued. But in Rajasthan, it is in high double digits. And one of the reasons has been the high VAT. And in fact, last month only the petrol pump dealers there went on a strike, saying that, people, the trucks, before they enter Rajasthan, they get their tanks filled. So their revenues are being impacted. So they are asking the government to consider reducing VAT. So that is also one reason for elevated inflation in Rajasthan.
And just to look at it, these are all little inklings of what possibly matter to people when they go into vote. Of course, there's food inflation that matters, but little things like this, fuel inflation and how the fuel pump associations must be so worried about the fact that a lot of their revenue is fallen because people are filling up outside. These are all electoral points. Now, Sankalp has a question to do with Rajasthan, which is, why does Rajasthan find itself in a double quagmire of high inflation and high unemployment? Is diverting money towards welfareism hurting the state's industrialization prospects?
So inflation and unemployment in the case of Rajasthan are two distinct problems. And if we focus on Rajasthan, inflation has been identified as a policy problem, and the government has been doing a lot in this financial year. We've seen that in this year's budget, the Chief Minister announced a 19,000 crore package for inflation relief, which includes giving subsidized cooking gas cylinders for ₹500, giving additional Manrega employment, then providing free electricity of up to 100 units to a certain class of consumers, providing free electricity to farmers. So the plethora of schemes were introduced to ease the burden of inflation on households and on farmers. So this package was introduced in the budget, and then they initiated what is called the Mehengai Rahat Camp. Inflation relief camps were introduced in the first quarter of this financial year, mainly to invite people to get registered and then make use of these schemes. So yes, and they have extended it beyond the designated beneficiaries that are identified by the central government. So even beyond the Ujjwala beneficiaries, the cooking gas cylinders are being provided at subsidized rate.
That even the center also did. There was the LPG subsidy subsidy did, it extended it beyond the Ujjwala.
Yes.
Right, right.
So that is there. Then a provision of free electricity. So a lot of things are being done, but still we see that inflation continues to remain elevated in Rajasthan. So inflation is a problem. And when we saw the fiscal side, when we discussed in the last episode about the fiscal side of Rajasthan, there also we saw that it is somewhere in between. It is not one of the states which is spending a lot on capex, but it is not something which is at the fag end like Punjab or say Karnataka. It is somewhere in between. But yes, as of now, having an eye on election, populism, welfareism, doing something to ease the burden of inflation on households is definitely on the agenda of government, and they are doing it at a very aggressive pace.
Right. And so that was the Rajasthan story. Now coming to Telangana, what is the inflation situation there?
So in Telangana, inflation has been very volatile. So if we look at the trajectory of inflation of the last 3 years in Telangana, inflation has touched 10% at various intervals. At various occasions, inflation
10%.
has been
Wow.
10% and even above 10%. So Telangana has on many occasions featured as one of the states having a high inflation level. And one of the reasons for the Telangana has been food inflation, because this is one state which is unduly impacted by seasonal swings in vegetable prices. So if we compare the vegetable inflation in most of the states, we find that Telangana is one state which is unduly impacted by the supply of vegetables. Maybe there are supply side bottlenecks, because in Telangana, rural inflation continues to outpace urban inflation. So rural inflation is a bigger problem than urban inflation in Telangana. And that is why a number of the opposition parties this time around, they have said that, they will rake up this issue, because again, pulses, spices, fruits, all these are the prices are very high in Telangana. Food inflation continues to remain very high in Telangana. And the other important feature of the inflation in Telangana is that clothing and footwear. Clothing and footwear inflation was very high in the last financial year. It used to be in double digit. So this is just the structure of inflation. So clothing and footwear inflation used to be in double digit in the last financial year, and now it is food inflation. It is still, it has eased. Overall, Telangana inflation has come down to 5.37% in October, but food inflation continues to remain elevated. It is above 7%.
But 5.37 overall inflation is still higher than the national average.
It's still higher than the national average. So 9 states have higher inflation than the national average in October, and Telangana is one of them. So out of the 4 poll-bound states, Telangana and Rajasthan are high inflation states, and Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh are low inflation states.
Right. So when we say 4 as in Mizoram, we don't have the data for Mizoram. So that's why we're looking at just these 4
big states, yes.
Okay, so then now coming to Madhya Pradesh, as you said, so it's a low inflation state?
It's a overall low inflation state in the sense that relatively, in Madhya Pradesh, inflation this time in October is 3.99%, so lower than the national average of 4.87%. But what has changed in Madhya Pradesh is that the trend of decline in inflation has reversed. So like in the sense in Telangana and Rajasthan, inflation has been declining since July, the peak of July. After that, just like national average where it was 7.44%, then it became 6.8, then 5, then 4.87. So in Telangana and Rajasthan also, we see the same trajectory that though inflation is elevated, it has been declining since July. But what has happened in Madhya Pradesh in October particularly is that the declining trend and inflation has reversed, in the sense that inflation in October is more than inflation in September. So that is one point, and that is again driven by food inflation. Food inflation is in September is lower as compared to October. In other words, October has increased. So in Madhya Pradesh, that is the point. And in Madhya Pradesh, there's a lot of competitive election manifesto that is
Yes.
being released by both BJP and government, particularly on the MSP, the minimum support price.
Right.
So Congress released their manifesto having a particular MSP for wheat and paddy. Then BJP released the MSPs, their manifesto where slightly higher minimum support price. So a lot of efforts are being put to woo consumers to vote for them by this minimum high MSP, and also again other things as usual for Rajasthan and Telangana. Here also we see promise made for subsidized cooking gas and also for free electricity. So all those things are there. But in addition, one of the important features of the election promises is higher MSP to support farmers.
Okay, and now our final state, Chhattisgarh.
Chhattisgarh has been consistently having low inflation, and this time also, and in September, Chhattisgarh had the lowest inflation across all states. So, and also food inflation has also been relatively benign as compared to food inflation in other states, because we spoke about food inflation as the key driver of inflation in the other poll-bound state, but in Chhattisgarh, food inflation has been lower, and that has to do with the vegetable prices. When in July and August we saw vegetable prices skyrocketing to 25%, 35% year-on-year inflation, in Chhattisgarh the inflation was relatively lower. So that led to a lower overall inflation. Even cereal inflation, which in all the other states is in double digit. In all the other states, mean the other 3 states that we spoke about. But in Chhattisgarh, cereal inflation is in single digits. It is 5 to 6%. So that is one reason, because cereal have a relatively dominant weight in the overall food inflation. Yes. So if cereal inflation is lower, food inflation will be lower, and overall inflation will also be lower. So there are these extreme cases where in Rajasthan and Telangana, particularly, it's going to become an election agenda, and it is a sore point for the ruling party. But comparatively in Chhattisgarh, the problem is not that acute.
Right. So that's actually what I was going to ask you. That is it. I know that we are not going to try to predict the outcomes of the elections at all. But is it correct to say that promises of subsidies and freebies are more likely to work in the states that are seeing higher inflation, such as Rajasthan and Telangana?
We saw that working in Karnataka and Himachal Pradesh. All these subsidies, they did wonders, and Congress did win those elections, and that has been recognized by commentators also, that it is these things that worked, and that is what is happening in particularly in Rajasthan and Telangana, where that has become an election point. It has become an agenda where people are talking about the fact that the budget of households is being pinched because of higher inflation. And so if a political party will come into power, they will do a lot to ease the burden. So a lot of promises are being made centered around the problem of inflation to ease the burden. So definitely, at least in 3 of the 4 states, it is going to be an important determinant.
Okay. And so now we have one more question from Sankalp, which is, what are the drivers of state level inflation that we've talked about? But the other part of his question is that without a monetary policy at a state level, how can the state governments really curb inflation?
So see, when we talk about monetary policy, when monetary policy is looking at a CPI inflation number, that CPI inflation number at the all India level is actually a weighted average of the states. Right. It's not coming from anywhere else. It is actually a bottom-up approach where we first compute the inflation of rural and urban region, and then decide in which state it falls, and then come up with the inflation number of a particular rural state and urban state. So that is how the inflation numbers are derived, and then we do a weighted average to arrive at the all India level. Right. So in that sense, indirectly, monetary policy is impacting the state's inflation also, because the all India level number is derived from state's inflation. But having said that, as of now, we've talked about in detail that it's mainly at the all India level as well as at the state level, particularly in Telangana, rural inflation is very high, and
Right.
a lot has to do with supply bottlenecks, the fact that the supplies of vegetables are not reaching on time, and that is causing a supply bottleneck and leading to high prices.
And that's something the state government can try to fix.
Yes, so
Right.
it's not something that monetary policy can do. The central government is doing, state governments are doing so, but monetary policy will have an impact because the all India level number is also a derived number from states.
I understand. So now we have another question from the audience. It's from Saurabh. He asks, to curb inflation, the central government has imposed export restrictions on various agricultural produce like onions, wheat, rice, sugar, etc. Is this affecting farmers adversely and resulting in a loss of GDP? And will it help the Indian consumers in the long run?
Yeah, so there are a lot of studies conducted on the effectiveness of these export restrictions. Particularly, a study has been conducted by the Indian Council of Research on International Economic Relations. So it finds that all these measures are at best knee-jerk reactions. They do not have an impact, at least on curbing inflation. They do not have an
Right.
impact. So we have seen that there have been export restrictions on wheat last year. Then there were export restrictions on broken rice, then basmati rice. But we still see that inflation continues to remain elevated. The cereal inflation continues to
Yes.
remain a cause of concern. And now with the first advance estimate number that came out at the end of October, we have seen that the rice production is going to be lower this
You're
year
right.
as compared to the final estimate of 2022-23. So all the Kharif output is major crops, leaving aside one or two. It's estimated, this is first estimate, so it will undergo a revision, but overall the estimate suggests that the Kharif output will be lower this time around, and it has primarily to do with the erratic rainfall and the El Nino phenomenon. So export restrictions in such scenario actually sends a wrong signal. It sends a signal that there are supply shortages, and it then encourages hoarding and other activities which then the effectiveness of this on controlling inflation is lost, because if there are hoarding, it will not actually enhance the domestic supply of these
Yes,
crops.
correct.
So that is one case. So definitely they have not proved to be that having a very fruitful impact on inflation, and definitely they hamper farmers'
Incomes, because,
They
yeah.
definitely hamper, and in many states and in many mandis, farmers have gone on protest saying that
Yes.
especially when on onion curbs were imposed at the Nasik mandi, they went on strike saying that they will not sell. So all these things actually do not help either the farmers' cause, and it does not also help in curbing inflation to a great extent, and therefore does not help the consumers' cause also.
Right.
So what is important is to focus on more long-term measures like on infrastructure, on storage, on public-private partnership, on reducing import duties, on enhancing the supply rather than restricting supply, because it also hampers our ability to be a reliable international supplier in the
Right.
market.
Yes.
So that it hampers our trade prospects also. So overall, it does not do much impact. It may have a very short-term impact, but in the long run, neither it will benefit the farmers' interest nor it will help in lowering inflation.
Right. And so there you go. I mean, across the country, including in the poll-bound states, 4 of which we have analyzed, food inflation seems to be a big issue. Less so in Chhattisgarh, but much more so in places like Rajasthan, Telangana, and to an extent Madhya Pradesh. And now what this means is that a lot of the poll promises made by the various parties in these states become that much more important, especially if there are subsidies, if there are freebies. So that's how these inflation numbers can actually affect the elections. But on that point, that's all from us. Thank you so much for watching.